This is the beast. This is what we're trying to attack in the park. Ligustrum lucidum, or glossy privet. It came here from Asia in probably the 1700s, maybe even the 1600s. It was brought from Asia to Western places. Obviously not Texas yet, but people ask, well, why did anybody ever bring it here? A couple of reasons. One is that if you're out living on the frontier, this is a tree that will grow fast without a lot of attention, will produce a lot of flowers, which will produce nectar for making honey. And it also can produce a windbreak or a western shade for the afternoon. So for something you could plant next to your dwelling and then let it grow while you do the work that's going to keep you alive and let it provide all these benefits to you, this was a perfect tree. Why do we bring things from other places at all? Well, I kind of wondered about whether it would have been better to leave this back there myself. And I was doing some research on it and found a picture of a guy, a botanist, standing next to one in China. One question I had was, how big could these things get? Well, that one was a single-trunked tree with an 8-foot diameter trunk. That's diameter, not circumference. The guy who was standing next to it was a botanist from Harvard who he had found a fruit tree that the natives called peach blossom. It wasn't a peach tree, but that's what they called the fruit and the fruit tree. And it was a citrus fruit. And the botanist's name was Meyer. And we know it today as the Meyer lemon. So a lot of the benefits that we have in society today, a lot of the many neat things we have, came from bringing plants from where they were found to places where people lived. Sometimes they just get out of hand, and that's when we have problems with invasive plants. Figuring out how to stop it is another issue, or how to not bring a plant in that will become invasive is another issue. I'm really dedicated to it, but it's not what we're talking about today. Today we're talking about what do we do with them once we have them here. And the ligustrums we really need to get rid of. We really need to get rid of the glossy privets, this particular ligustrum, because they grow tall, they're evergreen, they produce millions of seeds, and hardly anything eats their fruit. So all of those seeds fall where the tree grows, and they sprout where they fall or where they wash, and they sprout in such great numbers that we often see the ligustrum coming up like ground cover. In other words, yes, its leaves are this big, but its leaves are this big, but you look down at the ground and you see no ground because there are so many of these seedlings growing so tightly that they cover the ground completely. I've done tests every now and then where I find ligustrums growing like that. I'll mark out a square yard of ground and pull up all the ligustrum seedlings I see in there. Consistently it comes up with a number between 100 and 150 ligustrums per square yard. When there are any natives that we can leave behind, generally it's only 3 at most. So they're just by sheer numbers, they will prevent natives from growing in the woods. Another thing they do that's really insidious is that they shade out even trees that are taller than they are. If you look up on this particular one, you can see where it's growing here, and if I can get in there, over here, that's a native soapberry. And you can see the soapberry doesn't have any leaves on the side where the ligustrum is. And that's in part because the ligustrum is much denser. It's really hurting from the drought right now, but it's much denser. The coverage The canopy of the ligustrum casts such a dense shade on that soapberry that all the leaves on this side of the soapberry are dead. And even when a tree is much, much taller than this ligustrum, it can take out the top, the lower half of the tree's canopy just by shading out those leaves. And that means that tree has not gotten enough sugar and is really at risk when a stressor comes along, like a drought. And so those trees are prone to die sooner than they would. We've seen that a lot in this park, where little ligustrums like this growing under a big, big tree have killed the big tree. So, how do we take care of that? We use a process called girdling. And since we use sharp tools, the first thing I'm going to do is put on my leather gloves. Okay. Our tools of choice are a putty scraper and a carpet knife. A putty scraper is a fairly stiff putty knife. It's half chiseled. In other words, one side of it is honed down. The other side is left flat. And a carpet knife is, well, a carpet knife. A lot of my volunteers love using these rather cheap ones, $2 or $3, I guess $3 or $4. I myself, in part because I'm the one carrying the tools, and in part because it makes a very portable toolkit when I'm working alone, I like this folding version. Push a button, release the blade, and there we go. Two tools I can carry in my pockets and have all I need to do to girdle ligustrums anywhere in the woods. There's this little tab in the middle that you have to move, and then you bring the blade in. And that's really great because it keeps the blade nice and locked, but it's not so good to me to have my fingers between a closing blade and, you know, whatever you would call that, something that can catch it. One day when I was just too tired to do that, I took one tool and did that. Simple way to close a folding knife like this without getting your hand in the way of the blade. So, there we go. What are we trying to do here? We're trying, when we girdle a tree, to take out the layer of bark that carries sugar. When we do that, we can starve the root system. The sugar's made up in the leaves, carried down through this layer of bark called the phloem. We're taking out the bark and the layer of tissue that carry the sugar. The sugar is made up in the leaves, and of course some of it's carried down to the roots to feed them. If we can keep that sugar from going to the root system, we can starve the root system to death. When the root system starves, the whole tree dies. This way we can basically kill the tree in 15 minutes. It'll take a year to die, but they'll still charge us with the murder. If we were to cut the tree at the ground or down here, we would be coming back forever cutting off the suckers that rise from that stump. So if you want to do it in less than an hour, girdle. If you want to kill this tree as a lifetime career, cut it at the base. This isn't the way we girdle, but I'm just taking out a layer of bark here. So I will probably get a little bit of this wrong, but here are the basics. We've got the outer tissue, which is the bark. This green tissue inside, I believe, is cambium, and it's distributed between the bark and this white tissue, which is the phloem. Something I want to point out here is the color of the phloem, white. I've heard some people say that to girdle a tree, you cut down to white wood. Well, that's white, and it looks like wood. The person who taught me that method stopped at this point, and all of the ligustrums he's girdled are doing fine. They completely recovered. I like ligustrums that die. So I'm going to shave a little bit more here And again, this is not the way we girdle, but I'm just trying to make it easy for you to see. But what I want to show you here is that you don't see wood grain here. You see real loose grain here. This is the tissue that contains the phloem. This is where the sugar's carried. This denser stuff inside is sapwood. Listen. Sounds like a distant woodpecker. This is the sapwood. It's denser. It doesn't have the cells in it that carry sugar. The key to what we're trying to do is to get down to nothing but sapwood. We need to take out all of the other tissue, phloem and cambium, that's in this outer layer. Phloem's important because it carries sugar, and if we leave any in place, it will continue to do its work. The cambium's important because it can form any other kind of plant tissue. So if we leave cambium cells in this gap, they can grow and they can form phloem. They can also, as you can see from the green layer just inside this strip of bark, they can also form tissue that will do photosynthesis. So even if they're not connected to the top of the tree, they can form their own sugar and continue to grow across that gap. Now, you've seen me pare off the bark from this tree. That's not the way I like to do it. And I don't like to do it that way because for a couple of reasons. One is that a straight knife isn't going to pick up all the phloem. It's going to cut, and it's going to slice through and leave behind whatever's on the other side of the cut. A curved knife can work real well. It's just that I haven't found the ligustrum yet that knows that all of its curves are supposed to match the curve of my knife. So what I do is make a couple of cuts around the tree. And when you're cutting with a carpet knife like this, it's real easy to come off like that. For the sake of safety, I found that as I come around, I try to do it with two hands, and as I come around, I try to make sure that that tip is always pointed towards the center of the trunk. And you know, this is going to be real hard for you guys to see, but actually cutting with the knife is the best way to do this. I'm going to go back and get a saw. But the point I want to make is that if you can hear this, that's the sound of cutting through phloem. It's kind of like you're cutting through canvas. You can hear it ripping individual chords. Once you're through the phloem, except where I'm scraping the side a little bit, you hear nothing. At that point, the tip has hit the much denser sapwood. It is scratching into the sapwood. It's hard to cut, but I'm all the way through the phloem. And that's why I like using the knife. The knife gives me definite feedback that says you've cut deep enough. I'm going to make the first cuts with a saw because otherwise it's going to be really hard to follow with the camera what I'm doing. Okay, my first cut was along here, right? And I make my cuts about a hand width apart. A ½ inch is plenty, but a ½ inch gives me too tight of a working area for me to use my tools comfortably, for me to work comfortably. So I'll just cut around like this. Cutting first with a saw is probably faster, but you know what? When I'm traveling, I like to travel light, and even having to carry a folding saw is a little more than I usually want to do. And even if I have the folding saw with me, I can work faster, all in all, if I just work with two tools. And one thing I do is to go ahead and do all the work with the cutting tool before I start the rest of the process. So we have two trunks on this ligustrum. I'm going to girdle both of them. So we'll make a quick cut back here. I don't have to worry about going all the way through. In fact, you know, I've talked about the positive feedback of knowing when you're through the bark. I found, after I started paying attention to that it was almost always the case that even when I thought I was sawing really deeply with the saw, I stopped short of cutting through all the phloem. So, yeah, this is now we'll get out our knife, and I'm just going to finish those up to where I don't hear anything. There's a little sound there. Okay, so continuing with this, I cut until I don't hear any of that ripping. The knife pointed towards the trunk and away from me. I do know from experience where the nearest clinic is and how much they cost. That sounds good. I'm going to finish that over here too. Rip, rip, rip. Smooth. A little bit of ripping. And smooth. Okay. Now at this point, I used to make 2 vertical slits like this through the bark, but if you've ever done a biology lab, you know about taking a wire loop and streaking agar jelly with a cell culture, and the cells drop off and grow wherever the wire loop touches, just about. Well, that's kind of what you're doing when you make a vertical cut like this. When you get down to this tissue, the sapwood, you're scratching into the sapwood and you're leaving, you're embedding a layer of the cambium cells into that layer. I've actually come back a month or so after we've girdled an area and have found that everything was perfect except for these 2 little strips of bark that were growing right where I had made that little incision. So I don't do it that way anymore. What I do is make a paring cut, just like I'm peeling a potato. And again, try to keep my body out of the path of the knife. And all you need to do is to get down below this phloem. And you'll see that I've done that in just a second. So now here's the easy part. I take my half chiseled putty scraper and I find the edge of the outer tissue. I put the chiseled side towards the inside, towards what's staying. That doesn't seem like it's the way it should be to me, but it is really what works best. Okay, so we've got the half chisel towards the trunk. It'll be easier on this side because I don't have to get around over there. And I just keep working my way through the bark. And if I'm really lucky, all of that comes off. And there we go. We've got off almost all the tissue we needed to get off, all in one piece. Do it again over here. And again, I'll go from this side, and I'll come back this way on this side. There. Work it back a little bit, work it back and forth. This one broke on me, big deal. Just start over. And take all that tissue off. And there we go. That's the easy part. Now, the next part is the most important part. We could walk away and leave this as it is. But let me show you something here. I'm going to have to look a little bit to find it. You see this long strip of tissue here? Peels off real easily. That is phloem. And if I leave the phloem in there, it will continue to transport sugar, it will grow bark, it will feed cambium, and the cambium will grow bark. You see how this is white here and turning sort of manila envelope color here? That stuff that's turning color is the cambium tissue. So if I see this turning brown, I know there's still cambium tissue in there. I can use a sharp knife all I want and cut and cut and cut, and I'm not going to be guaranteed that I get rid of that cambium tissue because the sharp knife will slice through whatever's there and leave the other side of it. But if I take the dull side of this scraper and scrape down, then I can very quickly get down to what I call white, dry-ish wood. And all I really need is a contiguous ½ to an inch ring of dry-ish wood around here to stop the bark from reconnecting across this gap. If the bark doesn't reconnect, the roots will die of starvation in about a year, and the top will die right behind them. Again, did I explain that what we've left here is the sapwood? Carries the water from the roots. What we've taken out carries, and this is kind of hard, but we're experimenting with an alternative. It's to take a cotton swab and rubbing alcohol and rub this area down. The idea is that it will remove the cambium. It also makes it easy for me to realize when there's a little bit of phloem left in the middle. It's easier to see after it's been dabbed with rubbing alcohol. I experimented with that last week, and those trees have not, they don't have any living tissue in the middle, but I'm still not sure that that's the right way, or that that's an effective way that will be effective year-round. It could be that it was so dry and hot last week that all the rubbing alcohol did was dry out the surface, and the cells stayed there but died from drying out. In other words, it's something that would help in the heat of the summer and would probably work today, but I'm going to keep experimenting with it and see if it always works. And the reason I think cells remained there is that when I came back and looked at those trunks last night, they were not this white color or a grayish color. They were a light brown, and that's the color of dead cambium. So I just go through and scrape this down. And go over here and do the same. And something you can see here, see how the wood's coming up in fairly long strips? If the strips are fairly long, I am probably getting at least some phloem in there. When the bark starts, or when the wood starts forming tighter curls, then it's a good indication that I'm down at the surface of the sapwood. And you see how this is curling. That indicates it's sapwood, but if it were phloem, I'll try and leave some on the next one. It's hard to do when you're so good at it. If it is phloem, it often just comes off straight. It doesn't curl at all. Okay, because it is a lot of work and it is a lot of detail. And I don't expect every tree to be done perfectly. What I try to do is come back through an area where we've done a project every now and then over the next couple of months, and if I see bark regrowing, fix that. The volunteers actually get pretty good at taking off almost all of the bark. where do I need to girdle? Should I girdle at the very bottom? It really doesn't matter. Just be sure that there's no green growth below the spot where you girdle. What about the little branches? Should I just rip them off? Should I take some of the top branches off the tree? No. You want that root system to have the same demand for water after the tree is girdled as it had before. So even if you're dealing with a branch this small, or even a branch, say, even a branch this small, I will girdle those branches because I want those leaves to be putting demands on the root system. The best place to girdle a tree is where it's comfortable for you to reach and safe for you to work. So if this was covered in poison ivy here, but really clean down below, I might try to get down lower. But another thing to look for is where the trunk folds in on itself. Like even right here under this knot, or right here under this knot. That little bit of depression is going to make it hard to get the last traces of cambium out. So you want to girdle in a spot where the tree is round like a pipe. No folds going in. And if you do that, it'll be fairly easy to girdle the tree and to let it take a year to die. The valuable thing about it's taking a year to die, remember we were looking at that soapberry right next to this tree and talking about how this tree was interfering with it. There are saplings down here, native saplings that this tree is interfering with. Right behind me, a wafer ash that's getting in part shaded out by this ligustrum and several ligustrums behind it. We found that in areas where they come through and just cut out the ligustrums completely and get them out of there immediately, the increase in sunlight kills a lot of these trees because they're not used to it. Kills a lot of the native trees that were growing in the understory. When we girdle and let the tree die over a course of a year, the amount of light changes slowly as those leaves wither and drop off. And so these trees in the understory can adapt to that. And we find that we don't need to replant in this park because the native trees are already here and we're just giving them a chance to slowly adapt to increasing sunlight and then giving them a clear canopy to take back over. So that's my story and I'm sticking to it.